Hi, I'm Zadie
And I'm Benito Vallejo.
and we are artists living in London who work across painting, installation, sculpture, moving image, sound, and performance.
Hello everyone, welcome to the National Gallery. My name is Priyesh Mistry. I'm the Associate Curator for Modern and Contemporary Projects. I'm delighted that you could all join us here this evening for tonight's talk as part of the Unexpected View series. As you know, this is a series where we explore a work from the National Gallery's collection through the lens of a contemporary artist and their practice, not only to explore new ideas and themes and to help us look at the painting again in a different light, but also to explore the different ways that artists work today. I'd like to thank Hiscox for their ongoing support for this series as the National Gallery's Contemporary Art Partner. So this evening we'll be discussing a painting in the collection that has been admired by so many people throughout history, the Adoration of the Golden Calf by Nicolas Poussin, the 17th century French painter. For those of you with eagle eyes, you might have noticed that actually we're not in the collection galleries where the painting usually hangs, and that's because this work is part of a special exhibition titled Pusan and the Dance, being held at the National Gallery in our ground floor galleries where we're talking from today. This exhibition explores how Poussin looked at the moving body to bring to life the classical world of gods and mortals with wild and raucous and riotous movement. Now I'm delighted today to be welcoming our guest artists, Zadie and Benito Vallejo, who I've been working with very closely this autumn as part of a live exhibition in our modern and contemporary programme entitled Dance the Music of Our Time, named after one of Poussin's most famous paintings of dance. This is a live exhibition of film screenings, talks and performances taking place in our galleries across this autumn. And the programme explores how artists today look to dance and the moving figure to reflect on how we might tell stories that might be more relevant to our contemporary society. Zadie and Benito produced a wonderful performance that took place in our galleries in October, titled Scorpion, a performance that I hope we'll be touching on quite a lot in our discussion today. So Zadie and Benito Vallejo have been collaborating since 2006. They make performances, films, paintings, sculptures and hand-sewn costumes, drawing on a range of characters and imagery sourced from music, the digital space, fashion, global mythologies and art history. In 2019, they developed various performances which were presented at the 58th Venice Biennial and at Art Night London, which later developed into an internationally touring exhibition. You may have actually seen their work at the Leeds Art Gallery and if you were lucky to be in Shanghai at the 13th Shanghai Biennial earlier this year, amongst many numerous projects that you've held internationally. So welcome Zadie and Benito. I think we should start our conversation by speaking a little bit about how we first came to Pusan. In our initial conversation, probably about a year and a half ago, but also how this then developed into an invitation to produce a performance in the gallery. So just firstly on Nicolas Poussin, it was interesting when we first started speaking, we were very much drawn to this painting because of the connections that we saw in your practice. So thinking about movement and dance, particularly thinking about how Poussin has explored a moment of this story from the Bible, you know, the story of Moses coming down and finding this community adoring a new God, not necessarily the God, in Christianity, but actually a different kind of God, this golden calf. And thinking also about animals and how you kind of reference animals and particularly animals through to various mythologies. And this led on to a project where actually we thought this could be an interesting invitation to see how a performance that you make might exist in parallel to an exhibition about dance and Poussin. So I wanted to ask, when I first came to you with this invitation, what was your first thoughts, and how did you approach the project to the ideas that you came to with the performance?
So thank you so much for inviting us to speak. The first time I had seen this painting with you, the thing that I most remembered about it was the movement, the painting, the dancing. I know they're not necessarily wearing costumes, but all the kind of colored garments. And then, of course, you have the Adoration of the Golden Calf, this animal figure at the top. And right away it spoke to storytelling and mythology, even though the story has been familiar to me because I grew up Catholic. So whilst that's kind of a small caveat of what the story is about, I was really interested in the color, movement, the central animal figure. And speaking about the performances in Venice and Art Night that Benito and I constructed, among other dancers and other persons that were involved, it kind of reminded me about how we use the Giardini space or other outdoor spaces to create performance without necessarily having a central exhibition room that we would use from. So when thinking about how we could do a performance in the galleries here, I think our first inclination was to think about the way in which we might approach outdoor space because it's quite large, and how the dancers and the costume figures could move throughout the gallery space. That's one side. But the other thing I think we were really interested in was the idea of exhibition making and how that's kind of the central point in the way we work with performance. Because we don't have performance as a background and we don't really have any formal training in that, I think you and I largely think about the way in which we can start that from the costumes as a set, mise en scene, or also exhibition making, and in this case really thinking about painting and the idea of time travel and paintings as windows and portals with which we can enter other spaces.
So Benito, just to kind of describe the performance, we had in room 30 in our gallery upstairs, surrounded by our pictures from our Spanish pictures, we had a structure built in the centre of the space that acted as a sort of set in a way, from which performers emerged and danced around, but it was a performance that was held very much in the round. So there were elements of kind of surprises and revealing, being hidden. And was that something that you were also thinking about in the construction of the paintings as well?
Yeah, I was thinking how we can activate the idea of like the window and how we can create a kind of live performance around like the bidimensionality of a painting. So building this structure that in the end was like a kind of like octagon was like made by 2 triptychs and closed by 2 curtains that was kind of like 2 doors that the dancers, they were like playing with, going inside and outside. So it was like a kind of another or new idea of being in a relationship with a space and audience, and how was like, instead of being like confronting the bidimensionality or like having like just the idea of being like the intimate size of being through a window or psychological window, was like more like that kind of like breaking the idea of like psychological and bringing the physical aerial or 360 degrees to be like following the dancing.
Well, I think also just kind of what you're speaking to is the idea of looking at painting and being able to access that space, which is a flat surface, and actually the physical construction of building a structure made of paintings where you are supposed to, as a spectator, look inside the window. The dancers are actually coming outside of the paintings physically, so it's this kind of playful conversation of using that space physically behind the paintings and also thinking about the front flat surfaces as kind of windows with which you can jump into as well.
And that's one of the themes that really echoes in this special exhibition around Pusan. What we learn in this exhibition is that Pusan also played a lot with different media in order to understand the moving body. So he was making figures with wax, as models in order to kind of help him compose. He would often also use different scraps of material to kind of shape the way that materials might drape over the body. And we can imagine him certainly doing this for the Adoration of the Golden Calf, where actually the scene is very complex. And you have these figures moving around in this composition in almost kind of intertwined and connected in so many different ways. And perhaps that's also a question about how you also think about your performances in relationship to the objects that you make. So often when we see an exhibition of yours, it's populated by paintings, by elements of the costumes which stand as kind of sculptural elements within the space, often referencing sort of aspects of nature or parts of the world of fashion. And then you have perhaps a film and this fantastic sort of soundtrack that echoes throughout the space. And could you talk a little bit about the process of that, and then how performance kind of comes out of that relationship to objects and to paintings?
So I think every single time you and I work on a project together, whether it's this performance or other previous exhibitions, it kind of always starts with the foundation or a seedling of an idea, usually in the form of a story, and that story is usually based on kind of traditional Korean folk tales or other mythological stories. And so the conceptual groundwork is kind of put forward first, and after that is when the character building really comes up. And that's when you and I often talk about what the characters might be wearing, because I think oftentimes what they wear really kind of illustrates or projects to the audience who they are. And also because sculpture and painting is so important to us, these are kind of the first elements with which we are thinking compositionally within space, whether it's an exhibition or a performance. And then from that, we will work with dancers who also bring in their own talents and ideas and creativity through choreography and dance movement and really help with the character building. It's really almost difficult, I think, for us to speak about these things in a linear fashion because they're all happening at the same time. So we're really thinking about the story first. So I need to come up with the story and concept, and this is something we do the groundwork together. We'll have meetings about what the costumes should be, meetings with the dancers, showing them the costumes in progress, and then they usually have a little bit of insight or commentary on how these things should be developed, because they're wearing them and really activating these soft sculptures. And then from that, I usually work on the sound at the same time. For Scorpion, I worked with an artist and composer named Sophie Mallet, who's based in London, but it was a very similar process. She needed to kind of really be understanding whilst everything was happening, and everything kind of gets molded in together. And with the paintings, maybe you can speak a little bit about this, because the paintings really acted as the backdrop theatrically for the dancers, but likewise had to be made really during the process of rehearsals, because the dancers also feature within the works. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how that process was for you, speaking with me, and then trying to figure out what this landscape was and kind of the different ways in which you wanted to use the ideas that we were speaking about in rehearsals, and how you kind of inserted them within the paintings.
Yeah, basically we were like thinking also the idea of bringing the dancers, the dancers that they were collaborating, Yumino and Yayu. So we were like also like filming them in their own rehearsal, also to incorporate the same movements that they will be like using. So we were like using frames in order to be like composing these kind of like dynamics, movements, and how in a way kind of like matching with the idea of like the circle, or the idea of like mirroring, or the idea of like say shifting, right? And also was like the idea of bringing the light and the colors and the shape, and looking also like the old masters like paintings. So anyways, like yeah.
But that's a really good point, Priyesh. Just if we go back to the painting, thinking about shapes. So here when you look at the painting, there are so many really interesting shapes compositionally that you don't always just look at limbs or drapery, you're really looking at really beautiful forms in negative space. And I think that's how you and I also speak about the sculpture, how that's going to impact the space that it's in. So we're really responding to the architecture. We're looking at all the paintings that are on the walls. So in a room that's heavily adorned with Velázquez paintings, one of our favorite painters, really thinking about kind of the tones or the mood atmospherically, and also not necessarily to adhere to that tone, but maybe also to push against it. You know, kind of what are we able to bring in that adds a bit of friction to the space. But then thinking about also with the movement with Jayu and Yumino, as you said, or even working with Sophie with the sound, thinking about everything in the aspect of form and composition, texture and shape. So something that I really love here are all the shapes of the legs. You and I had a conversation earlier. You were mentioning that it reminded you of a fan. For me, it reminds me of an octopus. So something that's completely abstract, but in many ways, oftentimes, these small abstract ideas really infiltrate and we absorb them and we kind of pump them out from our own work that might not have any kind of direct, immediate response or reference from a viewer, but we know that they're there, and sometimes they're often activated through those modes of looking.
And that was a really good point, Zadie, about the composition, and particularly with Pusan, when we think about the figures and how he's kind of made them flow through a painting, but particularly the dancing figures, where actually the focus is very much on the limbs and the arms and the legs. And this very much reminds me of a moment during the performance, at the beginning of the performance, which is, starts off very calm, almost meditative, while we're listening to this soundtrack. And suddenly you see a hand or a part of a costume come through the curtains. So suddenly your focus is on one hand or a particular feature in movement, or a foot or a toe. And in that way, it was almost kind of starting to build up a picture about a story, about narrative. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how that process evolves in terms of building up a narrative through various stages of a performance.
So, as I had mentioned before, the groundwork for the performances is always kind of built out of story and an exhibition, kind of solid static objects. But whilst you're working with other living people, real people, you need to mitigate the kind of pacing, right? So I think one of the things that we first talked about was we definitely wanted there to be a crescendo and a very intense moment, but you need to kind of build towards that. And as you had mentioned, the kind of limbs that are so present in the paintings that, you know, obviously allude to movement, but they're static. I think this is something that you see really clearly in that movement, as you were saying, at the beginning of the performance, which I won't take credit for. I think this was Jayu Korti who had suggested that because they were so ornate in what they're wearing, which is essentially kind of the painting or the sculpture aspect of them, they really wanted to show that part off. And one of the things, as you can do that, of course, or something that's quite sensual about the body is something that's partially covered and just something that might be a wrist or an arm. But just even that statuesque form, we were really thinking about what that would look like on the other end of the gallery when you just see two disparate limbs kind of sticking out of this structure, and what that form looks like when it's still and when it slightly gives you a little bit of movement. You know, there is a little bit of a thrill because finally something is happening. But yes, it does start off very slowly in the beginning.
And in a way, we could think about this painting in that way as well. But as a painting, it's static. But there is a sort of element of stage time, almost in a sort of cinematic way, as you were kind of describing. I think the kind of drama of a performance can lead to a crescendo and these moments of stillness, but here we have it all in one, in a way, you know. Another aspect of this painting that I kind of wanted to talk about, and I think connects to your work in an interesting way, is the fact that actually the golden calf isn't a calf in this painting, it's a bull. Poussin was very clever in the way that he would almost kind of compile and combine various references to different kinds of mythologies. So here, yes, it's a biblical story, but the bull might refer to an Egyptian god or a different kind of form of mythology that relates to a different kind of art history, very much done in this way to cater to his patrons who are very knowledgeable in different kinds of art forms. And I guess this kind of leads on to a question about Scorpion and the performance, because the crux of the narrative was based around these characters, the character of a trickster who is an archetype from various different mythologies. So you touched on before the fact that you often start from these folk tales from Korea, but then they kind of speak to various kind of mythologies around the world. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the narrative was behind Scorpion?
So I was really interested in this trickster archetype, I think just largely because of its rebellious nature and how the trickster is often thought about through a patriarchal lens. So when I say that, the trickster is usually or traditionally thought of as a male figure. So I was really interested in kind of exploring the idea of the trickster as a female character, but particularly as it ties to the nine-tailed fox spirit from Japan, South Korea, or China, and how this character is able to shapeshift and basically trick their prey, who happen to be men or people, for their liver and their intestines, and through this consumption of bodies, they are able to attain more wisdom, longer life, or the ultimate goal of also becoming a human. And the reason why I focused so much on this character was because of my interest in kind of appealing to audiences everywhere. So Benito and I had worked on an exhibition that originally premiered in Canada at Remy Modern, but then later traveled to Leeds Art Gallery, and there was a fox character that was heavily featured. And that fox character was based on my interest in this nine-tailed fox character, but also because foxes are so ubiquitous in the city where we live, in London. And I was really interested in the way this character in the city is treated or viewed as by us, as kind of someone who's infringing on our territory, who's a malign kind of pest, something that we're trying to get rid of. This is how it seems to feel. And so I was really interested in exploring this figure as seen through the perspective of a nine-tailed fox character and a seagull, who I also kind of think of as a maligned figure within the urban landscape. But also, I was really interested in introducing these ideas of trickery and trump oil painting in the structure, which is something that you really were also keen on. And so we had spent a lot of time in the National Gallery, I would say about 12 times together, thinking about these painterly trickery devices, which would then feed into the overarching narrative of a rebellious figure that is not willing to kind of shrink itself or conform to societal pressures of conventional being. But maybe you can talk a little bit about those conventions in the paintings.
National Gallery has a really large collection that goes like from very kind of like, I will say like from the Trecento until like 19th century. And there is like many ways to represent space, and in a way that they were like using this kind of like formulas of representation was like very interesting to see how it tends to kind of represent time or like different moments of time, and how they were like building in different periods systems or maybe like different artificial setups in order to be able to situate themselves, like the figure, and also to incorporate other scenes in order to be like able to talk about, as we talk like in storytelling, or like we can like represent or like seen in the comic, for example. No, you can see there is like a linear way to understand space, and you can tell that when you are like walking through different rooms, you can see that there's like, it goes from like more psychological spaces until they are going into this kind of like tricks that they use, like a trampaloil, or like they are using like different ways to incorporate like windows or like portals. Like so we were like using all these kind of different references
yeah,
also
because
to
time travel.
yeah.
Time travel is also
absolutely,
something that we're quite interested in. We wanted to incorporate within the performance. So not only is the overarching narrative kind of based on the trickster archetype and what we're thinking about how maybe an outsider figure needs to, or rebels or refuses to conform to societal norms, but also trying to really play with, again, the idea of painting, the history of painting, and create a surreal landscape where we were thinking a lot about someone like Magritte, but also, as you said, walking through the National Gallery and seeing a lot of different paintings, even from the Gothic period, of these moments where there might be a painted fly that's so incredibly precise that it tricks you into thinking that there's a fly in the painting, but in fact it's part of the scene. So within the paintings there is that idea of trickery, inspired by the trickster, where we're able to look at different time zones perhaps through the devices of using windows, portals, glass panes. You don't know what's reality and what's fiction, and we're really thinking about kind of theatrical sets and film sets as that backdrop.
And I think it was really effective actually in room 30, you know, surrounded by our Spanish pictures, where you had this structure that you encountered when you first walked in the room, with that kind of trompe-l'oeil effect, where actually I think it kind of confounded you in a way. You weren't sure whether it was another doorway into another space, because it's so alien to the kind of design and the architecture of our galleries. It made you sort of double think. And I think that's a really interesting idea. And perhaps actually that folds into another question I have about not only the set, but the way of kind of thinking about the costume. But how you first approached that idea of showing a performance within this quite grand and quite particular space of the National Gallery.
So I think when we first started talking about the costumes, I was really thinking about different costume designers that we had been influenced by through television, film, and theater. One of the things that's really daunting when you're working in the National Gallery are the paintings and how ornate and incredible everything is produced. And so I went away with you and looked at a lot of books and realized quite quickly that maybe the silhouette, the shape of these costumes were really important. So rather than using kind of painterly or illustrative techniques, which we might normally do, we decided to work on something that was much more monochromatic and dealt with form. So in previous costume work, we've kind of worked a lot with dip dyeing, illustration, and masks. And for practical reasons in the gallery, we thought maybe it was not a good idea to use masks to kind of obscure the vision of the performers, but instead, again, like I said, work with shape. So whilst one is creating the costumes for a fox or a seagull, I wanted to keep things theatrical, like we spoke about, but I didn't want things to look really hokey or cheesy, which is very difficult to do. So I thought that maybe looking at things through a fashion lens would be best. So I worked with a costume designer, a professional tailor named Manuel Vadillo, and he helped design the costumes with me. And what ended up being so beautiful in the space was all the references that we didn't really realize that ended up manifesting in the costumes. Whilst Velázquez's Pope was not there in the room, this is a painting that you and I have loved and seen many times in Rome, and for whatever reason, all of a sudden manifested himself in the costume of the fox character.
Well, in a way, that kind of also connects back to Pusan, because in the previous room, we have an amazing portrait of Cardinal Richelieu, who was a major patron of Pusan's. And in this portrait, in this full-length portrait, he's wearing this extraordinary red gown, in the same way that we had the fox character in this incredible kind of gown, which then became part of the performance in a way, where the seagull and the fox came together and really played with each other's costumes in this quite extraordinary and powerful way.
The drapery becomes very important. This is something that you had spoken heavily about, incorporated in the paintings, and we also incorporated physically on the structure with the use of dip-dyed curtains that the performers would enter and exit the paintings from.
Just to add to what Zadie just mentioned, I think that was a good point to see how Poussin was using very simple and basic colors, but that doesn't mean that was like in contrast with all the layering and very complex way to work. So I think that was like a good point to talk about how was like built all the layering in the costumes. That was like patterns that were like quite complex, but also in really select color and uniform colors.
Mm-hmm. So instead of using kind of an explosion of colors like we normally do, really reducing everything to red and white and gray, and then really focusing on the silhouettes and the drapery.
And it was a really beautiful performance and really powerful, especially in that space with those kind of simple colours. In a way, you know, thinking back to Pusan, yes, it's kind of a riot of colours, but actually each of the kind of textiles that drape these bodies are very kind of simple in tone. You know, he doesn't necessarily use patterned fabrics in any way, but each character kind of layers another aspect of the narrative. And I think on that note, it's a really brilliant way to kind of end our consideration of Pusan today. But also, I just want to thank you not only for giving the talk, but also for participating in Dance and the Music of Our Time and producing a very beautiful performance here in our galleries. Thank you, Benito, and thank you, Zadie.
Thank you.
Thank you.